Dean Burt lay there, sinking deeper into the mattress as a wave of heat overtook him, a hot, feverish sweat that blurred the line between reality and whatever strange realm he was now drifting toward. In the haze, he saw them, Jez and Camille, standing beside him. They looked so real, so vivid, yet he knew they'd been gone for years. Still, here they were, flickering between childhood, small and innocent, and old age, wise and worn, yet always holding on to that youthful spark in spirit. It was like they existed outside time, embodying every version of themselves all at once, unbound by the world's limitations. Dean Burt felt an ache rise in his chest, something beyond the dull throb of his failing heart. The world as he'd always known it, this real world, had no place for this essence, this strange, boundless truth that felt more genuine than anything he'd known in life. There was no fitting word for it, no description that could capture the wholeness of it all. I wanted to know them, he whispered, barely more than a breath. I wanted to save them, and maybe save myself. But the thought slipped through his grasp like sand, leaving him empty, defeated. The idea of salvation, of any place where peace could be found, felt as illusory as the faded pictures of the life he'd lived. No utopia, no heaven to retreat to, just this world, spun tight into a controlled corkscrew, fueled by consumerism and fleeting pleasures. He let out a low chuckle, bitter and hollow. I wonder if anyone else has ever wondered what undamnation we're all spiraling toward. The words hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as the faces of Jez and Camille drifted further into the shadows, slipping out of reach. The county nurse strolled in just as Dean Burt hovered on the edge between life and whatever comes after, though there was no fanfare of high-tech machines or the gentle murmur of concerned relatives. He was on borrowed time in a borrowed bed, with others lined up, waiting impatiently for their own turn at what she knew as the end of the line. This was the system, and Janine knew it well. Still, there was something about Dean Burt's quiet determination, the fire in his eyes as his body approached its expiration date, that gave her pause. "Please, ma'am," he rasped, his voice crackling like old paper. "Could you pass me my journal?" She shot him a hard look, the kind that had been honed on the unforgiving speedways of Sacktown traffic, where every inch was fought for, every glance in the rear view showed faces hungry to beat you, cut you off, own the road for that fleeting second. Her own eyes, weary and sharp, had learned to mirror that ruthlessness. "That'll cost you, you old asshole," she snapped, a half smile playing on her lips. It was instinct, the armor she wore, polished each day by her ritualistic battle against city traffic and the blank, unfeeling stares of strangers. Still, even as she stood there watching his frail form, her mind flashed with those relentless thoughts, questions she couldn't shake. Do they even care if I live or die? Are they all truly just crazed demons inside? And am I? This was Janine's existence, her unchanging cycle, a hard, relentless grind that had stripped her year after year of parts that would never return. And here was Dean Burt, with nothing to his name, no cash, no jewels, not even a bus pass to his own final destination. Just this journal, worn and tattered, clutched in his hand as if it were his last connection to the world. But as her gaze softened ever so slightly, she handed him the journal. She saw a flicker in his eyes, a rare, desperate spark, like he'd been waiting all his life to tell someone something. And for a split second, she wondered if, in his last words scrawled on those pages, there was a truth she hadn't yet glimpsed, a glimpse of something outside the controlled corkscrew of her own life. "Don't waste it," she said, though the words came out quieter than she intended. The battle-hardened edge in her voice faltered. She wasn't sure who she was speaking to anymore, him or herself. As Janine gazed down at the journal, she could swear it began to unravel, spilling its contents in a strange, surreal cascade. The pages, some inked with faded blue, others scribbled in dark, rusty reds that looked like they might have been scribed in blood, seemed alive with the stories they held. These weren't cheap tales mixed with pieces of old movies and half-baked dreams. No, these words breathed. His life, his memories of Jez and Camille, his yearning and pain. They lived on. It was as if the lives he'd so desperately tried to save, and the story he'd clung to all these years, were spilling back out into the world, refusing to be silenced. For a moment, Janine felt the impossible. Colors seemed to seep out from the book, swirling and spinning like sketches brought to life. Spheres of color appeared, vibrant as if sketched in full and furious strokes with colored pencils, each one bearing a fragment of Dean Burt's story. The book slipped from her fingers, and as it hit the floor with a heavy thud, the colors faded, leaving her in a room far more ordinary and far more charged with weight. Dean Burt let out a soft groan, tilting his head back toward the peeling ceiling, his face softening with a final, knowing peace. His breath slowed, his airway open, head slightly cocked to the right, as if he were gazing into something far beyond the limits of this dingy room. There was a stillness that filled the air, a purity so foreign it sent a shiver down Janine's spine. And then, faint but unmistakable, she caught a scent she couldn't quite name. Are those roses? She murmured, glancing back at him, but she knew, somehow she knew, that Dean Burt had finally passed. His soul had left, drifting beyond whatever stories he'd left behind. And for the first time in years, Janine felt something in her hard, tired heart crack open. She'd never shed a tear over the death of a patient before, never cared enough to feel more than a passing moment of curiosity. But this was different. She felt it, real and raw. A life, once full, now gone. As the weight of it sank in, Janine knew that this wasn't just any moment. This was her wake-up call, the sign she'd been waiting for, an invitation to step outside the narrow, bitter cycle of her own life. It was an intervention, a moment of reckoning, and it pierced her like a blade. Dean Burt, even in death, had done something no one else ever could. He'd forced her to feel, to truly see the life she'd been so quick to disregard. And for once, Janine didn't brush the thought away. She held onto it, clutching the strange, sacred feeling in her chest, as if it could be her own beginning. As Janine turned to leave the room, she felt it, that prickling sensation that someone or something was watching. She glanced toward the doorway and froze. A figure stood there, just at the threshold, his face half hidden in shadow, leaving only the left side visible under the dim, backlit glow. His expression was unreadable, his presence somehow both subtle and overwhelming. He murmured, "Only in the end do we find the beginning." The words so soft they seemed to drift like smoke. As he slipped away, his black suit caught the light just enough to reveal an unsettling texture, almost as if it slithered with the fluidity of scales. The strange man seemed to drain the room of its warmth, the faint, rosy scent that had filled the air with Dean Burt's passing, now a distant memory, leaving a hollow chill in its place. That was when Janine's pulse quickened. She asked the security guards if they'd seen a man matching that description in the halls, but each shook their heads, indifferent and unfazed. The third time she asked, they offered to show her the footage just to placate her. Frame after frame, they scrolled through the recordings of the corridor outside Dean Burt's room from every angle, every camera, but nothing. Not a trace of him. One of the guards, a self-proclaimed paranormal expert with a YouTube channel and a snarky grin, muttered with a smirk, "Men in black, huh?" His joke fell flat until Janine, clutching Dean Burt's journal in frustration, flipped open to a page covered in elaborate symbols and strange patterns. Her eyes darted to a drawing etched in faded ink, lines and shapes intertwined in a way that seemed both chaotic and deliberate. "Now that's some freaky shit," the guard exclaimed, peering over her shoulder with a newfound respect. "I think they call that symbol Metatron's cube or something. Yeah, that's like serious metaphysical stuff. Sacred geometry, you know?" Janine didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the lines that seemed to pulse on the page, as though holding secrets just out of reach. Dean Burt had left something behind, something she couldn't explain. And as she stared at the symbol, a chilling certainty crept over her. This was no ordinary ending.